right now. I don't know. I don't think two people can record. Okay. But thank you. I'm trying to get the participants going up somewhere too.
Okay, I've just turned off the sound, so there shouldn't
good.
be any more chiming in.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Phil.
Hi, Rob. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Phil. How you doing?
I'm good.
Good.
We end at 3:20, so it's a tight turnaround here.
Yeah, I think it's a tight turnaround for everybody. Bit of a rush, but hopefully for everybody, so you all can just sit back and relax. I think I'm the only one that's sitting in a hot seat, at least for now. For now, in a moment, we'll put everybody in the hot seat. It's 3:30. I'm going to get started right on time. Welcome, everybody. So happy to see so many people here after a long working day, and I really appreciate you giving me the privilege of speaking on assessment, and I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half. I am intending to share some ideas on assessment just for 1 hour. I'm really hoping to reserve the last half hour for sharing, because I think that really was the title of this, is assessment sharing. So hopefully if things go as planned, we will have 30 minutes at the very end for questions and for sharing ideas. My name is Michael Pruner. I am recording this session. I thought I should say that right off the bat too, because I have had a number of emails from people that aren't able to make it, and they were really hoping I could share a recording. So from what I understand, the recording only captures the shared screen and people who speak, such as myself right now. So hopefully that's okay with everybody here. I'm going to introduce myself. I am a high school mathematics teacher, currently teaching at Windsor Secondary School in North Vancouver. I think it's important for you to know who is my support network. This is my family. On the right-hand side of your screen is my daughter, Sandra. She is in grade 11 this year at Windsor Secondary. And next to her is my son. He graduated last year at Windsor. That's Nathan. And my youngest daughter, Naomi, she's in grade 9 here at Windsor. And those are my kids they have no fear in sharing their feedback about what they hear or about what their dad's doing at Windsor. So a lot of what I'm doing, I have to say, is shaped from some of the feedback I'm getting from my own kids. To my right in this photo is my wife, Leanne. She is an elementary school teacher at Ridgeview in West Vancouver. Also has a specialty focus in mathematics. So I consider myself quite fortunate to be able to talk math at home. And we share what she does and what I do, and a lot of the things that are happening right now in my classroom are also a direct result of conversations that I have with my wife. So that's my family. This is where I'm speaking to you from. This is Windsor Secondary School. I'd like to acknowledge and honor the history and culture of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. That's whose territory I'm speaking to you from right now. This is North Vancouver, the North Shore, sitting at the foot of Mount Seymour. So that's where I'm coming from. On the screen right now, I have a few pieces of information that you might want to jot down. The first is that bit.ly address, bit.ly/assessbc. If you punch that address into your address bar in your browser, that should take you to a Dropbox folder where I've put a large assortment of resources, including this particular PowerPoint. So you don't necessarily need to take notes. However, I do recommend you have a pencil and paper handy, because we will be doing some mathematics, of course. Also on there is my email address. Feel free to contact me if the bit.ly doesn't work for you, or if you have any questions about this presentation tonight, this afternoon. And last is my Twitter handle in case you want to tweet. So getting the show on the road, I'm going to start things off. Oh, and I have the chat window open on my screen. So if anybody has any questions. 4:30 in God's country. Love it. If anybody has any questions or any comments, please feel free to chat and just throw it on in there. I know Rob's monitoring it for me, but I also have it up on my screen, so I'll be keeping an eye on it. Okay, we are going to start off with some mathematics. I will never host a large gathering of mathematics teachers without partaking in a little bit of mathematics. To me, that would be a big waste of our time and resource. I mean, we are all math geeks, so let's do a little bit of math. I've actually got 2 tasks today to squeeze into the 1-hour session on assessment. My first task has to do with drawing lines. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to visualize drawing a line on a piece of paper and thinking about how many sections you've divided your piece of paper into. How many regions? Oh, don't be shy. It's an easy question. How many regions, did you divide your piece of paper into? Thanks, folks. Thank you. We are alive. That first question was just to test whether or not we are breathing. And we do divide our plane into 2 regions. Now, don't shut out the answer yet. I want to visualize drawing another line on that region and thinking about how many regions we are now dividing the plane into. That's right, Steve. There's 2 possible answers now. So I'm going to narrow the question's focus down, and I'm going to say, what is the maximum number of regions that we can divide the plane into? And the answer, as you can see, is 4. So with 2 lines, the maximum number of regions is 4. This is the task that I'd like you to play with. And I'm not going to give you too much time, unfortunately. On your scrap piece of paper, I want you to investigate adding lines to the page and maximizing the number of regions. And let's see what we notice. And feel free to post questions or observations in the chat room. I think if I was in radio right now, I'd lose my job. Giving you a little bit of time to investigate this. Please feel free to jot down anything you notice. We're not looking for final answers. Any observations at all? Just once. All right, folks, I'm gonna ask you to stop what you're working on right now. Unfortunately, that was not enough time for you to engage properly in this task. And it also wasn't with enough people. Most of you were working independently on this. So I apologize for that. But our purpose today is to talk about assessment. And I would like to move on without actually addressing the answer to this question. There were some interesting ideas in the chat room, but I am going to draw that to a close. Feel free to continue the chat if you like, but I do want to talk about, or I want you to think about a little bit on how you were engaging in this task. How did you do? I'd like you to think for a moment about how well you were visualizing while you were working on this problem. Were you actually able to jump to a different strategy when you found that one strategy didn't work very well? What did you do when you got stuck? Did you get stuck? Did you have an opportunity to explain your ideas? If you did have an opportunity, or if you could have that opportunity, would you be able to explain your ideas and justify your thinking? Did you have that opportunity in that short amount of time to show any curiosity and maybe try something different or deeper in the task? So with those thoughts in mind, on that same piece of paper, can you write something down about something that you were proud of over the last 5 minutes? Of course, you don't have to share this. This is personal. Just keep it to yourself. Unless, of course, you're super proud of it and you want to share it to the whole world. I'd also like you to take a moment to write something down that you'd like to improve. We are going to be doing another math task in about 15 minutes. And if you could set a goal based on those 5 competencies, can you set a goal for yourself? Okay. So we're going to put the math aside for a moment, and we're going to begin the conversation about assessment. Assessment in my classroom. I was asked to share a little bit about what I'm doing in my classroom with respect to assessment and curricular competencies. And that's what I intend to do. But I think before I get too far into things, I think it's important for me, first of all, to talk about my beliefs with respect to how students learn and how I should teach. I think beliefs are very important. I think beliefs dictate or decide what happens in anybody's classroom. I think if you look at what teachers are doing across the province, most of what's happening in classrooms across the province comes from what teachers believe. So I need to share that at the very beginning, and I'm going to take some time to share that. After I've explained or described to you what my beliefs are concerning math education, then I will share a little bit about how that impacts my practice and what my practice looks like. That's my sharing time, and that will take probably about 15 or 20 minutes, just describing exactly what's happening in my classroom right now. And then, as I've said a few times, I am hoping to have a segment of time at the very end for sharing. So if you have any huge questions, jot those down on a piece of paper, because we will have time at the very end to address those questions. But more importantly, we've got almost 60 mathematics teachers in our room right now. So we have this huge collective experience. So I'm really hoping that we will have some ideas to share amongst all of us, and we will all be able to walk away today with some ideas moving forward with assessment. So beliefs, what are some of my beliefs? I thought that instead of me just listing beliefs, I'd rather just pull out some quotes of books or articles that I've been reading lately to kind of color the picture for my beliefs. One of them, this is actually a quote of a quote. This is Anne Watson writing about Richard Skemp. Richard Skemp wrote an article where he described different ways of understanding in a mathematics classroom in 1976. And he described, basically it was a dichotomy of ways of understanding, one of them being an instrumental understanding compared to a relational understanding. Skemp writes that an instrumental understanding is the type of understanding where it's just rules and procedures without a whole lot of reasons behind them. Whereas a relational understanding is an understanding where students actually know the why and the what and the when and how things are connected. Relational could be thought of as that deeper understanding that I think most of us crave in our students. Most of us desire our students to come out with a more of a relational understanding rather than the instrumental. But he also suggests that the relational understanding, which we tend to desire more, is really not an understanding that you can directly teach. And this is why I pulled this quote out. I really like this. He suggests that the relational understanding is something that students need to develop themselves. And that they don't develop it at any one moment. They develop it over time and through experience. And I thought this was a really nice way to frame one of my beliefs, because I do believe that as a teacher, my role is in setting up experiences for my students. And it's through these experiences, these mathematical conversations and engagements and problems, that they slowly start to evolve and develop these understandings, these really deep connections in mathematics that I desire for them to develop. Another one of my beliefs can be found in one of these quotes from Romagnano in 2001, wrote an article called "The Myth of Objectivity." If anybody has heard me speak before, I've often bring this up. I still read this article regularly to remind myself that objectivity really isn't possible. And this is, I think, a bit of a surprise for math teachers. I think the mathy types tend to think that what we do can be objectively measured if we have the right tools. So in this article, which by the way, I've included a bunch of these articles in the folder that I'm sharing. In this article, he basically dispels this objective idea through different examples and different sets of data that he looks at, essentially coming to the conclusion at the end that no matter what we do, no matter how careful we are, no matter how much time goes into our assessments, it's impossible to really know what our students are learning. He writes, objectivity, like the mythical pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, would be wonderful if we could have it, but it really just doesn't exist. It's an impossibility. All assessments of students' mathematical understanding are subjective. And that absolutely is something that I've come to believe over time, which reminds me that when I am assessing, it is not definitive. Everything that happens in my classroom, every piece of data that I collect is kind of fuzzy. And I need more and more data to give me confidence, but I will never be 100% sure. Anne Watson writes, after describing all of these different attempts to assess students that weren't working so well, she writes at the end, the questions lurking beneath all of these comments are whether it is ever possible to know what goes on in a learner's head, and what it is we are really saying when we claim to have assessed a learner. Okay, and I'm quite pleased to know that I believe this. I think it would be a rather disturbing world that we would live in if we could actually know precisely what is happening in a student's head. So it's just not possible, and I'm kind of glad that it's not possible, but it really presents a difficulty when you're assessing. Yeah. And again, this speaks to this idea that we need more data. Any particular data piece, no matter how carefully it is collected, is never going to tell you a complete picture. She finishes it off with a crucial characteristic of sound judgment is open-mindedness, and a further one is self-doubt. And I think as a teacher who is responsible to produce a grade for a student at the end of the year, which does have consequences, I think it's important for me to be reminded that that I'll never be sure, I'll never be certain. And I need to always be open to that as well. So that's a little bit of my reading that I think frames my beliefs as a mathematics teacher. Let me describe a little bit now about how that has framed some of my assessment decisions that I've made. So these are some beliefs, particularly that I have regarding assessment. I've got a long list here. Let's go through them one at a time. When I started teaching, I was a huge points person. I think that was my mathematics experience. Going through high school, it was all about collecting points or earning points. And then when I started teaching, that was what I implemented right off the bat as a first beginning teacher. It was all about testing. It was all about quizzing. It was all about collecting points. And students would always know how they were doing in that course simply by carrying out the division of points earned over total points possible. And they would always have that. That would be an ongoing percentage mark that they would have over the course of my course. So at any given time, they'd be looking at, for example, 72%. And what does that really mean? So I've shifted. As you can probably tell, I'm no longer a believer of points gathering. I am now a believer of collecting data. So I do still have assessments where points are awarded, but I also have many other assessments where it is a matter of collecting data. And data is more than just points. Data creates more of a picture. And then that leads to my second dichotomy here, disaggregating versus aggregating. In a points world, you're always combining points, you're always aggregating it. Whereas now, when I'm collecting data, I always like to keep it separate so that when I'm reporting, it doesn't get reported, at least not at the end of the year. When I'm progress reporting or sharing how students are learning with parents or the students themselves, I like to keep everything separate. So students can see exactly what areas. Like this isn't too different actually from what Phil was saying last time we were all here together with this criteria-based grading. Like keeping everything separate so students can see what areas that they actually are weak in or areas that they need to improve in. So disaggregating always, I only aggregate now at the end of the year when I have to produce a report. It's actually 2 times. I should have said at the very beginning that under COVID, we're teaching in a quadmester system. So I'm currently teaching just 2 classes and we have 8 or 9 weeks with these 2 classes. In the middle of those 8 or 9 weeks, I have to produce an interim report. So I aggregate for that interim report and then I have to aggregate again for a final report. I'll be sharing a little bit about that at the end. But those are the only times in the year that I aggregate. Everything else that gets shared, everything else that my student sees is in a disaggregated form. I believe in learning as a process versus learning as a moment in time. I think it's very possible for students to learn a chapter after the chapter is finished. So if you think about the extremes of this conversation, one extreme would be having a chapter test at the end of, say chapter 2, and then whatever score a student earned on that chapter test, that's done. They will never have an opportunity to retest on that again, versus learning as a process. Like I have my students for 9 weeks. It's not fair for them just to have one chance on an assessment. I mean, if over the course of 9 weeks, they can somehow demonstrate that they've eventually attained understanding in a certain topic, they should be recognized for that. So learning takes time. I know that learning takes time. I've seen that every day in my classes, how students learn at different rates. So I should be honoring that in my assessment. And then lastly is this idea, it's almost like a social justice issue. I believe that the purpose of assessment is to inform. My goal as a teacher is to educate my students. I want my students to learn. So my assessing should be focused around that. It should not be focused around producing a grade to get students into post-secondary or scholarships or rank them in the class. How is my son or daughter doing against the class average? That's not the reason why I'm doing this at all. The only reason assessment serves a purpose in my classroom is to inform my students, to inform my parents, and to inform me on where my students are and how I can help them grow in the course. Yeah, thanks, Phil. I totally agree with that comment. Bruce, I don't know, I just don't know if I have the energy to get into a Vygotsky and radical constructivism conversation right now. I do believe in a lot of what Vygotsky writes, but I'm just not prepared to go down that road right now. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I am watching my watch. I'm going to move forward. I wanted to share this. This is something I found. I think David Pym shared this with me in one of the classes I took with him. Is the origins of the word assess. I thought this was so beautiful. The root word assess comes from Latin, and if you pick it apart, it actually means to sit by. I thought that's such a beautiful thing to think about. If we're assessing our students, the real meaning of assessment is to sit with your student or sit by your student and hopefully support them in their learning. So that is what assessment for me is all about. Those are my beliefs about assessment. Okay, so we are about to move in to what assessment looks like in my classroom and how do I get around the curricular competencies. But before we do so, you have recently participated in a math task and you wrote a note about what you were proud of and you wrote a note about a goal. So let's take a look at the goal that you wrote down. And we're going to move into task number 2. I apologize if you've seen this before. But task number 2 is, again, you're not going to have enough time to do it. We're just going to get started just to kind of whet your appetites. But I'd like you to count the number of squares that can be made by joining dots. Count the number of squares that can be made by joining dots. And I am going to give you a little bit of time to play and share some chats in the chat room. Thank you, Phil. Thanks, Beth. Nice. Yeah, until it's not. Wouldn't that be beautiful if it was 42? I do have some math problems that end up with 42 just by total fluke, and it always blows my mind when it comes up. Barb, I think you've done this one before. Gosh, eh? Only way to turn on a group of math teachers is to give them some math problems. Look at that. That's awesome, folks. I'm going to stop you there. Oh, which size areas can I make? Nice. Nice. I'm going to stop everybody there. I know that's not enough time. 1024 is very, I'm sure there's a way to make this 1024. I am going to stop you there. Somebody said I better have an answer on here. I do, but I'm not sharing. However, if you go to that bit.ly site and download the PowerPoint, there are lovely movable squares, which if I was really technology able here, I would be able to move these squares, but you can actually move the squares onto the screen and count by moving the squares. And yes, there's a huge aha moment, which is why I love this question in front of a group of students. You can see them all working away and working away and working away. And then after about 10 or 15 minutes, one group gets, aha! And it's the turning your head 45 degrees, and all of a sudden the floodgates open and everybody dives at it again with a whole bunch of new energy. So it's a really fun question to share with the class too. But no, I'm not giving an answer. I apologize. The bit.ly site will be posted, Beth, again at the very end. But of course, if you go to that bit.ly folder, you can see the bit.ly link in the folder as well. Oh, there it is. Thanks, Mark. Smart kid. Okay, so again, I'd like you to think about those 5 competencies, visualizing on this problem. Were you flexible? Did you try something different? Did you persist and keep trying when you got stuck? Were you able to explain your ideas if you were working with somebody or in the chat room? And did you go any deeper in this task? Take a moment to write down something that you're proud of. Now, what I would be interested in right now is if you were my students, I would be interested in the thing that you wrote that you're proud of. Was this related to the goal that you previously set? And then make yourself a goal moving forward. All right. I think I'm right on schedule. Everything's looking great here. I'm going to now take my beliefs, which I shared with all of you, and I'm going to shift them into practice, starting with my guiding principles. So my beliefs shape my principles in how I design my assessments. Here are some of my guiding principles. I believe that assessment for learning is going to take, assessment for learning always takes priority, meaning that comments will always trump grades. There is a significant amount of research, or at least research that's very convincing, that as soon as a number or a letter grade goes on an assessment, students stop reading the comments. So as much as possible, I try to create assessments that don't involve grades or marks, just comments, especially when I'm in the middle of assessing their learning. And also the popular metaphor of assessment as a navigational tool. I'm always thinking about assessment as ways to help my students progress towards better understanding. And just like navigation, students need to know where they are, they need to know where they're going, and we should be doing our best to point them in the right direction to make that trip. Here's another big phrase that I say quite often, is that I think we need to put value on what we value. If we only put value on our tests and our quizzes, then subtly that is giving the message to our students that tests and quizzes are the only things that are important. And I know, because I've spoken to math teachers all over the province, I know that there's not that many math teachers who think that tests and quizzes are the only thing that's important in a math class. Ask math teachers what they think are important or what they think is important in a mathematics class, and tests and quizzes is on the list, but it's on the list with so many other things. And so it's our job when we're designing our assessment to also put value on those other things. Not everything that is assessed needs to count. And this is something I've been noticing lately, because I think I took the what gets graded by teachers is what gets valued by students. I took that too far and I started grading everything. And I don't think everything needs grades. I think that you can just notice things, collect assignments, exit tickets, chapter checks, whatever they might be. And you don't have to grade them. You can put comments on them, but it's that point of noticing them. If the teacher is noticing them, that's like valuing it. And then students start to value those same things. So when I'm when I'm deciding on my assessments, I'm making sure that I am attending to things that I value in math education. Written work often falls short of the whole story. This is a little bit about that objectivity comment I made earlier, but just because they write it on a test doesn't mean that that's exactly what they know. There are other pieces of data that I can bring into play that maybe if there's disagreement, maybe if somebody then I'll be willing to try something different. I'll be willing to sit down and have a conversation, or I'll be willing to rely on maybe observations that I've had in the class as well. And then lastly, which is kind of the theme for this presentation, it's that competencies share the stage with content. As a son of a gun, I'm getting phone calls right now, so sorry that I'm distracted here. I just keep having to hang up. Competencies and content, those are our learning standards. That's our new curriculum document. We actually have to teach and assess and report out on competencies as well as content. In fact, if you look at the document, competencies are on the left-hand side, which suggests that maybe they might be more important. So I need to make sure that my assessment captures that. It doesn't mean I'm throwing content out, but I have to pay attention to it. And that's what we're talking about here. How on earth do I bring competencies in a way that, that captures their learning? So this is what I'm doing. This wheel is a wheel I created at the beginning of this year to communicate to my students how their final grade was determined. I was lucky to have 2 classes of Pre-Calc 12 in September. And if anybody's taught Pre-Calc 12, you'll know that these kids are highly mark motivated. And it didn't take more than probably half an hour of class before I had the question, how do we get a final grade in this class? How do you figure out our final grade? Because we're going to be applying to so-and-so. So I created this little image to communicate to them how their final grade is determined. And as you can see in this image, content is part of it. I have content at the bottom of the wheel. And I do still measure content through unit testing. But I do have ways of assessing, as you can see, those 4 curricular competencies, which make up the top of that wheel. And so this is the image I share with my students. And as a teacher, as an educator, I can share with you, when I'm putting this together, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. I want to make sure that I'm using things that are already in practice. I've been teaching for a significant amount of time. I believe I've developed a lot of good assessment practices. So what I decided to do is I decided to take some of those assessment practices and just redirect them, retool them. And that's what I'm going to share with you right now. I should also say right now that I designed this method of assessment with a colleague of mine. I was fortunate to work with Graham Barber, who's now currently in the Comox school district. But Graham and I were helping prepare for him to teach summer school, and he really wanted to bring in the curricular competencies. So I remember it was over the course of about four or 5 weeks, just meeting every single lunch and trying to come up with a model that would authentically measure growth in the curricular competencies. And this is the model that we came up with. So we talked about retooling in the sense that we were both doing good things in our classrooms already, but just redirecting how that assessment tool was measuring. So for example, I've been using group quizzes in my classroom for a long time. I'm not sure if anybody has not tried a group quiz in our group right now. We've got almost 60 of you here. If you haven't tried a group quiz, I mean, this should be the very first thing you try tomorrow. It is mind-blowing, the level of engagement and discussion and argumentation that you will hear in your class when you put a quiz for them to work on in groups. So I've been using group quizzes for a significant amount of time, something I was quite proud of and quite happy with in my classroom. And so we decided that group quizzes were a great vehicle for measuring how students communicate and how well they'll represent. So we just basically allotted that part of the wheel to group quizzes. And we're actually going to share a specific example about a group quiz in a moment, just in case you're wondering what that looks like. Does class size make a difference? Well, at the beginning of the year, this year, I had 2 classes of 30 each. So everything I'm sharing with you is based on that. So they were pretty, in my opinion, they were pretty big classes. Yeah. So in my experience, class size on the high end doesn't make a difference. On the low end, it might. I find sometimes with really small classes, you don't have enough variety in the class for ideas to generate or move around. But definitely large class sizes, this works really well. Daily reflections are also something I've had in play in my in my classroom for a long time. I can't remember who it was that first turned me on to this, but this idea that learning really doesn't happen until you reflect on it, until you actually think about what you've learned. So I've been asking my students to respond to reflection questions at the end of every class. The reflection questions are always around my learning goals. So I've been doing this for some time. It just so happens that there's an actual heading for a curricular competency that has to do with reflecting. So it was a really natural fit for me that I would put reflections or my reflection assessments under the category of reflecting and connecting. And then the other 2 curricular competencies came under the banner of problem solving for me. Also something that I've been very active in my teaching. Problem solving has always been a big part, whether it be non-content based problems like the count the squares one that we just played with, or just even problem solving to do with content. It's always been a big part of my class. So I thought that reasoning and modeling and understanding and solving really fit nicely under that banner. So what I'm doing is I'm retooling. And I think I'm not expecting people to always to retool the way I've retooled. What I'm suggesting is take this collection of assessment that you're already doing. And just, if you'd like to start assessing curricular competencies, it might just be as simple as redirecting some of these assessments to capture these particular aspects of their curricular competencies. So we're not reinventing the wheel. I still give unit tests, but my unit tests, I don't have that many of them. So in a typical year, in a typical class, instead of having 10 chapters and 10 chapter tests, I break all of my years up to 4 units. And students, when they write their unit test, their tests are always retestable. So that's the idea of honoring the process of their learning. So right now, because I'm teaching in a quadmester system, every Monday is retesting Monday. So students are always in a cycle of signing up for a retest and retesting, and signing up for a retest and retesting. And that's their opportunity to slowly start iterating and hopefully generating a significant progress in that content item that they're retesting under. But I do lots of things, as I mentioned earlier, that's not graded. So I thought I should share that as well. Lots of opportunities in the class for students to be assessed and for them to get some feedback. So my group quizzes, they all get marked, sorry, they get comments, they don't get grades, and the group quizzes come back to them annotated with comments to help them with their understanding. Almost daily, I give my students exit tickets, which also result with comments as well for feedback. Do students need to earn their retest? They need to do some things to do a retest. I don't know if earning is the right way to put it, but the qualifications for a retest are they have to come in and show me their corrections, and then they have to complete a small practice assignment before writing the retest. But usually doesn't take too long for them to go through those steps. And as I said already, I mean, my Mondays are pretty busy with students completing their retests, and they earn full marks. Yeah, that was I was expecting that question. I started retesting quite a significant amount of time ago, and I would say, okay, cap it at 80%, cap it at 70%. But you know, deep down, I don't see any reason for capping. I mean, if they are able to demonstrate good understanding on that, why can't I just give them that understanding? So I removed that capping idea some time ago, so now they can earn full marks. In fact, I always take the highest. If they don't do as well in the retest, then I keep the original mark. What else do I do that's non-graded? We do chapter checks because my units usually are made up of 2 or 3 chapters. We have moments in time where they have an individual assessment that kind of feels like a test, but the mark doesn't go anywhere. It's just feedback for them and something that they can hopefully learn from. And I take a peek at their reflections, and I take a peek at their homework, and I make notes whether they're complete or incomplete. I find this is most valuable for conversations with parents. But again, that mark doesn't go anywhere. It's just feedback for the students and feedback to the parents about how well they're working in the course. How many different versions? It depends how, so the question in the chat is how many different versions of a unit assessment do I have? It depends when that unit assessment was given in the course. So in pre-calc 12 at the beginning of the year, the unit 1, because they were allowed to retest every week, I had kids that retested every single week on that unit 1. And eventually some of them earned 100%, which was fantastic to see. So I may have had maybe 4 or 5 different versions of that test. But I do find now with the test making software, I find it's not very hard to make a retest. I mean, I started teaching in 1994, and I remember making a test on foolscap paper with a ruler and whiteout and tape and scissors. And I remember it took hours to make a test. It doesn't take me that long anymore. So I don't consider that the workload that it used to be. I'll definitely check that out. Thanks, Phil. All right, I said I was going to give you an example because a lot of this is just talk. You need to see it in practice. So this actually is an example from my Pre-Calc 12 class. This was the group quiz that they were working on. I try with group quizzes because they're working at whiteboards. I try to keep the quizzes a little bit more open. So in this one here, this was during transformations. The group quiz was use the function provided below, and it's above, silly, to demonstrate everything you know with respect to 2 of the transformations listed. So everything you know about translations, reflections, or stretches, pick 2. Give them a significant amount of time to work on this quiz on the whiteboards. The nice thing about having them on the whiteboards is that if a particular group is stuck, then they can get ideas from other groups. And so the learning is happening indirectly. It's nice to kind of observe that, but most often because they're in groups of 3, they're usually just arguing with each other and trying to grab each other's pen and fighting over getting the answers on the board. It really is quite exciting watching a group quiz. So, so they work on the group quiz. I go around the room, I take pictures of all their work, and I bring it home at night and I comment on it. I just write comments on what I liked and what I didn't like, and that's what I'm about to share with you. When they're finished the quiz, they go back to their tables and they complete a self-assessment on communicating and representing, which I'm going to show at the end. Yeah, so here is a little bit of their work. This is one group here. My comments are always in red, and their work is in black and blue. So you can see I'm commenting on the notation that I like, notation that I don't like, and things that maybe they've missed. Would be nice to see domain and range, maybe function notation. So they get this back the next day, and I encourage them to make corrections. And that's hopefully an opportunity for them to push forward in their understanding. Here's another example. Generally pretty good here. I mean, you can see how big this whiteboard is and how much when you open the door and say that, you know, tell me everything you can. Sometimes they write a whole lot of stuff. There wasn't really a whole lot to be critical of this one. I like the next one, this group here. They kept writing all the way to break. This is one group's work. 3 people took up a whole wall. And lots of things here. I mean, it took me a little longer to read it, but definitely some neat things. Starting off with, oh my goodness. But definitely, if you read it, there were some really insightful things that they noticed and that they were sharing. So it was really a neat thing for me to put feedback on. But at the end, they go to their tables, and this is a self-assessment that has been iterated over about 4 or 5 years now. I found at the beginning, the self-assessment had letter grades on it, and I asked my students to indicate what letter grade they think they should earn under communicating and representing. And that didn't work so well, probably for obvious reasons. So I've moved away from having students put letter grades. My self-assessments now are much like the assessment I asked you to do on your 2 math tasks. I'm really looking to see how well my students can set goals and how well they can achieve those goals. So if we look at the top 4 rows, these top 4 rows come straight from the curricular document. These are the bullets under communicating and representing, but they're written as I can statements or I am able to statements in a bit more student-friendly language. But the idea here is that students are to indicate on these arrows how they think they are achieving in each of these categories, or how they think they are doing in each of these categories. But for me, the goal of this part of this exercise is it's to activate what I'm valuing in this assessment. So students have an opportunity to think about how they are doing in each of these categories. So it's activating this as, this is important. This is what I'm valuing. So after they've gone through those 4 rows, it's really just for them. Now they know what's important, what we're valuing as a class. Then they will now say, what did I do well? And what would you like to improve on? What are you proud of? And let's set a goal for next time. So just some quick examples from, I think this is from October or September. Student writing, I think I did a good job sharing ideas without fear, and I demonstrated a thorough understanding of concepts using graphs, words, and analogies. What I'd like to improve, I'd like to cut down a little on how much I write and stick to the key concepts. I think this might have been the student that had the 2 walls of work. Anyway, I have an opportunity to comment as well. So I do read through their self-assessments. Just looking at the goals right now, I'd like to get better at using math vocabulary because I'm pretty good at showing my work, but I'm not very good at explaining it with the correct math words. I think I should try and let my partners do it and just add instead of always interrupting. I remember this person. This is that student that just dominates every conversation, even during class, right? That's kind of, every time you're asking a question out to the class, like he just yells out the answers. I remember him very well, and I think it's nice to see in this reflection, like he's well aware of his need for constraint in his communication, and that turned out to be one of his goals in the term for that year, was to work on listening a little more, not always just yelling out and dominating the conversation. So this is a self-assessment. These are examples of my students sharing with me what they're proud of and goals that they like to move towards or improve on. And then for me, I need to turn these into some sort of proficiencies. So I developed this rubric for giving it a grade. So the idea is that I wait till I have 2 pieces of data so I can actually see how well they're able to set goals and achieve their goals. And so in order to be proficient, a student needs to indicate 1 or 2 areas that require growth. And then on the next one, actually is able to demonstrate some progress in those areas. So that would be a proficient for me. And emerging, a student indicates multiple areas that need growth, but does not show any growth in these areas, or these areas are not related to communicating and representing. I'm finding that more early on with my students because they're trying to develop some familiarity with my assessment system. Sometimes they're putting goals in that have nothing at all to do with communicating and representing. And so it takes a few of these for them to start to see what I'm looking for. So my students hear it quite often in my class. All I'm looking for is I'm looking for you to set goals and achieve goals. Set goals and achieve goals. And this this language of communicating and representing is beneath all of that. It's pretty common language in our class. So this is some of the data that I've collected. My next slide is sharing just a sample of a progress report. I wanted to give you an example of what I mean by keeping my data disaggregated. So this is what a progress report looks like in my class. I mean, at the beginning, it might be too much to look at, but I think it kind of makes sense as we go through it here. Let me just talk about it with you. I'm just trying to grab my pointer. I wonder if I can do that. Laser pointer. All right. So up in here, these are the 4 curricular competencies that we're measuring regularly throughout the class. We were just talking about communicating and representing. So here I can see this student, for the first time they did receive an A, and the second time they received an A. For reflecting and connecting, which is another self-assessment with a similar marking scheme. First time they received an A, second time is an I. And that might, I don't usually give I's if they're not here. Usually the I is they didn't fill out the form properly or something like that. But the point that I'd like to make though is that, I mean, I don't average these out. If a student has demonstrated, you know, pretty good goal setting and achievement in reflecting and connecting, I'm going to honor that as an A. The only time I would change this A is if I found it was an A at the beginning and then it kind of goes to a C and a C again. So if they're not showing growth, but they're actually showing degradation over time. But most of the time it's the higher mark that I would take. Up here in reasoning and modeling, I have assignments that students hand in. And so this student received a B on the first one, and then they did quite a bit better on the next one. They received an A. I have a sample of this assignment in the folder that I'm sharing with you. So for this competency, I'm going to be giving my student an A for that competency. Okay, but the idea right now is it's disaggregated. I think to a certain extent, I mean, there's a certain a bit of aggregation here in the sense that this is all of Unit 1. But when I'm standing back and looking at how my student has done over the course of the year, I mean, I can see which unit my student had more difficulty in. It's in Unit 3 in trigonometry. I can also see that these are retests because my retests are smaller than the original tests. So the mark ends up scaling up to a mark out of 20, which is why you have that odd decimal of 16.7. So the 18.3 and the 16.7 are likely a result of retesting. Okay, and then I've captured more data down here. This is really informative for parents and for students. This is me checking in on their home practice and their reflections over the period of a bunch of days. Okay. So that's essentially me taking my my marks program, which is really just is a spreadsheet, and then I've linked my spreadsheet into this progress report. So I do have to aggregate, and I think that when the data is disaggregated like this, I think aggregating is possible, but I like to also keep it subjective. And this is how I end up aggregating. I look at my curricular competencies, of which I've collected a lot of data here, And I make a judgment as to, you know, if I was to give a letter grade for all of their curricular competency work, what letter grade would this student be at? And I look at this as an A, understanding and solving is a B, reflecting and connecting is A, communicating, representing is an A. So I'd say overall, this student is showing A-level work with curricular competencies. Then I look at content, and that's a little bit easier because those are just marks. So content, I've got, you know, an A-level work with content. And if this was grades 8 or 9, I'd be done. And it's really no decision to make. But because it's grade 12, I have to give a percentage. So I end up using these benchmarks or cut scales for percentages. An A in my class can be anywhere 86, 90, or 95. And so now I make a decision as to, you know, which one of these is more representative of the work that I've seen from this student. And I like this idea of combining percentages with letter grades because it really gives me pause to think about the student and other data that I might have for this student, and that other data could just be observations I've had with that student over the course of that year, or, you know, there might be other pieces of data that I want to bring in, but then I make a decision based on all of the data that I have to come up with a percentage for that student. And for this student, I think it was 90%, which I think is a pretty fair percentage. The nice thing about having data disaggregated in this way, Phil, I will touch on that in a sec, just give me a sec, is that it's really nice for reporting out. And this is another time where I have to give credit to my colleague Graham, and in fact his fiance Rebecca, because they were able to, or Rebecca's like the queen of Microsoft Excel. I can't remember exactly what career path she's in, but she was able to create a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that can take those data and turn it into a comment. So based on each of these pieces that I have, I was able to create comments for my students that are very disaggregated. I mean, saying exactly which content section my students didn't perform so well in. You know, minimally satisfactory in the Unit 3 test covering finance, or, you know, which curricular competency area they needed to work on. And so I was able to create these really specialized comments based on the data that I had. Phil made the comment about 100%. So yeah, I don't often give 100% because I just don't think it really makes much sense to give 100%. I mean, basically, when I sell this to my students, it's essentially saying, no matter what I do, there's no way I can differentiate between 75 and 76%. Like, I do not have an assessment tool that is that good. As I shared with you earlier, that's part of my beliefs. I don't believe that anything I do in my class is objective enough to make a decision between single percentages. I have a tough enough time with these 5% spreads that I'm sharing with you right now. But I do think it's reasonable to say whether somebody's a low B or a high B. I can differentiate between those types of students. I can differentiate between a low C minus and a higher C minus. So I prefer letter grades, but if I have to give percentages, then these benchmarks, I feel like I can confidently decide on how my students are attaining in the course based on those percentage spreads. I do give 100%, but they're very rare. And I think we can all imagine those students that we've come across that do earn those 100%. But most students, most of my top students are sitting at 95%. I do make a bit of a change for grade 12 students because I know that, especially my academic grade 12s, I know that a lot of them are applying for scholarships. And I actually overheard a scholarship committee person say that they awarded a scholarship to so-and-so over somebody else because their average was 97 and the other person's averages was 99 or 98. Like they made a decision on scholarship because of that 99 compared to the 98. And I was like, oh, I really hope that's not happening in a scholarship committee, but I understand that that can happen. So for grade 12, my 95 at the end of the year, I turn it to a 98. So those high A students so they're not getting robbed from scholarship or entrance considerations. My 95 percenters actually end up with a 98. I don't advertise that, but I end up doing that at the end of the year. Do I get angry parent students that need scholarships? No, I don't. In fact, most of the kids, because I hand these progress reports out to students after every unit test, most of them have a good understanding of what they're getting or what I would give them before the report card comes. So some of them come in and chat with me and we have this conversation together, but most of them understand how it goes together and they're okay with it. I think I'm sitting at the time where I wanted to start wrapping things up. To finish it up, I mean, I think it goes without saying, this is just a model. This is something that I came up with a colleague. I am not saying this is how you do things. I hope that I didn't lead anybody on that way, but I'm hoping there's some ideas in here, and maybe some of these ideas are interesting enough to some of you to change some of your practices. So I'd like to finish up with, that's the end of my slideshow. I'd like to move into the other period or the other portion of this, and that's the sharing or the questions. So if anybody has an idea to share or a question to ask, maybe to me, but maybe it's also to the whole crew, now's a great time to ask. Questions and sharing, yeah. Oh, you noticed that, Chantel. Because I have to give a letter. I mean, in the way my marking is working right now, I have to give a letter grade for this. So if you read the fine detail of what extending and proficient are, to me, that's both, they're both A level. Having a student setting goals and making those goals, that's fantastic. Having a student that's already fully meeting, that was in the activating their understanding at the top there, already fully meeting in every category, but still able to set a goal and meet a goal, that's still an A. I mean, I think I should also say though that these give different comments on my comment generator. So that might, so I do distinguish between these. I just don't distinguish between them on this because this ultimately is what gets turned into a grade on their report card eventually. So I don't distinguish between extending and proficient on this. However, it does give different comments. The retesting's been fabulous. This is what I've noticed. I've noticed students saying they really appreciate the retest because they're finally given an opportunity to learn, or they're finding that this is the only way they're really understanding the material is by going through this retesting process. So my students and parents are all very appreciative of the retesting. I haven't seen it take away at all from the class to any extent. So no, I haven't noticed that at all. And I've been doing retesting like this for 5 or 6 years. So this progress report that I have on the screen right now is actually the progress report that I send out with my students. And if they're not familiar with my teaching, it does require some description at the beginning, but very quickly they're able to read it and share it with their parents. I actually haven't had any comments from parents at all in the past at least 6 months about these this type of grading. Comments are coming in and questions are coming in like crazy now. Yeah, the retesting that the software I use for retesting is just ExamView. but before ExamView, it was LXR, and before LXR, it was something else. Like there always seems to be something that different schools are using to make tests. Yeah, I think I should say also, and I might just be skewering myself here, but I'm not overly, like, I know content's important, but I'm not, like, the tests are not the be all and the end all for me in my course. Tests are part of the process. I like to, as I shared at the beginning, to me, the be all and the end all is the engagement and the activity and the discussion around mathematics. So that's what I work really hard at. I'm trying to create engaging, exciting lessons that students just, can't stop arguing about. That's what I really value, because I know that in that experience, that's what's changing them. The testing is to me, it's a necessary, it's my necessary piece to get content assessed. So I'm not overly worried about my tests capturing every single item in a unit. So maybe that's why I'm able to make them a little bit quicker. Jonathan's comment, how do you use Excel to summarize? Yeah, like I should do a workshop on Excel. I have learned so much about Excel over the past few years of implementing this. Like, it is the most, it's amazing for a couple of reasons. It's an application that has been around since like 1986, right? Lotus 1, 2, 3. And it's probably the only application that is in almost every industry that uses mathematics in some level. Like, it is an absolutely amazing application, but it does take time to figure it out. I was very lucky to have Graham and his fiance help me out with it. So a lot of the stuff I learned because I was working with a colleague, and it's pretty difficult to share in this amount of time. But Excel is magic. It's really cool stuff. I'm just trying to work my way through these questions here. There seems to be a lot. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. For reading Phil's comment on proficient, yeah, I would agree with what you're saying with content, and I would agree with that. But for me, not for curricular competencies, for that particular competency that I was sharing, to me, that was proficient. To me, proficient is able to do. And if I'm looking at how well they're able to set goals and achieve goals, then to me, that's an A. But you can change that. I think that's nice that we have that freedom. Definitely some good comments here in the chat room. Yeah, that's interesting, Annie. I know that I'm not sure if you made that comment earlier, but it's come up a couple of times about not taking the original test serious enough. I mean, I only have 4 tests. So over the course of, if you're in a linear system, over the course of 10 months of instruction, to only have 4 times in the year where they're sitting down during class and writing a test, I mean, it's pretty hard for me to imagine them not taking it seriously. Like, I mean, in my experience, like those are pretty important days. Like, they're so significant because there's only 4 of them. I haven't had the feeling of students gaming that. But if they're not ready to demonstrate their understanding at that time, then maybe that's okay too. I mean, they'll have another opportunity to do it. I guess the problem for me would be if it's now June 30th and they're still trying to find ways to retest. Like, there's only so much I can do. But that might be why during the year I decided to only have retests once a month. So I didn't want to be devoting too much of my personal time to opportunities for students to retest. So there was a specific day. I think it was like the first Monday of every calendar month would be retesting Monday, and then that might fix that up a little bit. Yeah, I'm just reading Sophia's comment on the proficient versus extending. To be honest, I don't use proficient and extending in my other curricular competencies. I just stick with letter grades for those ones. So my proficient and extend, and as you can see, I kind of blur them together in the two assessments that I do use them in. I use them in my self-assessments for reflecting, and I use them in my self-assessments for communicating. And they end up both being A level for me. I can tell from the conversation that might be arguable, but again, I think that we do have our autonomy in that, and we can make decisions how we think best work for our students. Yeah, I just have I end up in my rubric for understanding and solving and my rubric for reasoning and modeling. It translates to an A, B, or a C, or an I, or an incomplete. But maybe somebody else has something to offer on that. Yeah, I agree with Rob's comment. Yeah, so there's a great question, Nicole. I didn't cherry pick, although it may have looked like a cherry pick. I really just grabbed a random assessment here when I came up with this. It was pretty easy to come up with an A. So what happens when it's not as easy? Well, that's when I'm really thinking about the student. I think in the end, I have to trust my subjective judgment a little bit on coming up with a grade. What happens if they get 92% on content, but a C on curricular competencies? Well, I can tell you, they're not getting an A anymore. I value curricular competencies as much or maybe even more than content. So I'll probably end up with a 75%. I'll probably end up with a B. That hopefully wouldn't be a surprise, because if they're getting 92% on content and a C on curricular competencies, likely that that was something that would have shown up on an interim report or on a progress report as well. But yeah, that to me, that's not good. It's also not very common. I would suggest normally my curricular competencies tend to bump up rather than bump down. So that
Mike,
would be a tough one.
Just jump in here and add something to the conversation, because it leads a little bit to what we're going to talk about next time. But just going back to that concept or the idea of the objectivity and the subjectivity. And I think some teachers may be uncomfortable with this notion of moving away from objectivity, even though I think you and I agree that it's, you know, if you were to consider what we do objective, the question then is, what is the object? And we don't deal with objects, we deal with subjects, we deal with students and their minds and things. But I think what's interesting about that is John Mason would say that as we move away from objectivity, we don't necessarily just have to be alone in our own subjectivity. We replace objectivity with the resonance that occurs with our professional practice. And part of what we're doing here is, as we're negotiating and talking about, well, what happens in this case and what happens in this case, we're still in a subjective space, but what we're doing is gaining resonance inside of our own decision-making and judgment. So I'd suggest probably if you have a question about a student and you go down the hallway and you talk at a department meeting, you talk with other colleagues about what to do with that, it's replacing objectivity with being alone in your own, you know, alone in your room, you know, coming up with some subjective decision. That resonance that occurs in our collective professional judgment replaces objectivity with some, not certainty, but you know, landing inside of that space of being a little bit more comfortable with what it is we're doing.
Yeah, and I think to add to that is that, I mean, when I say our subjective opinion, I'm not just spewing out, you know, my best guess. I have data. I have a whole lot of data to support my decision that I make. So if, and honestly hasn't happened, which is, I think, as I'm saying it, actually quite surprising. If I have somebody come and argue about a grade that I've decided on, I mean, I can open up my book and say, this is what I'm looking at. I have, as you saw on that, as you can see on that sheet right now, I mean, I have tons of data, and each of those grades come from, and I've got data that supports those grades. So it's subjective, but it's based on my experience with my students. So it's not just
And that's where the validity comes in to the mark, right? The validity is that you're not just looking at test scores. You're not just looking at one particular way that a student has demonstrated knowledge. You're looking at what you've observed. You're looking at what what you've heard students say. You've collected problem-solving work and other things so that you get the validity as well as the resonance, so that you end up landing in a place that you feel pretty certain about.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. I think just because the questions are not coming in as much right now, I think I should share a little bit about moving forward on this. What am I not pleased with? And I think the level of disaggregation maybe is not fine enough. When it comes to my content tests, I think I could probably separate out those content tests a little bit more, so it's more informative to my students. So when I have a unit test that's covering 2 or 3 chapters, I shouldn't be too difficult to, instead of reporting out a unit mark, I should be able to report out an understanding based on more detailed topics. And that might be a place that I'm going to go move into. All right, we're getting pretty close. I'm going to stick around. So if anybody wants to chat with me individually, I'll stick around until 5 o'clock. But I think I'm going to stop the recording because that's dead space. It's no fun to listen to. And I'll finish with a big thank you for sticking around and listen to me chat and share. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email.